So Peter Wadhams, thank you very much for agreeing to an interview. I read your wonderful book, Farewell to Ice, which I thought was an amazing achievement.
Well, thanks. Hope you recommend it to all your friends.
Yeah, I will. And maybe
your master.
Yeah, well, indeed. Have you met the Prince of Wales? I wondered. Yeah.
Yes, I've met him a few times.
Yeah.
But back when, actually, that was way back when he was helping or being patron for Ranulph Fiennes' polar expeditions, and so was I. But I haven't met him recently, but I ought to send him a copy of my book.
Do. He'd enjoy it a great deal. I'm trying to write a book about how we might put things on a better track, and it's purposefully optimistic, but your book is very powerful because it shows what's happening, and it shows just the scale of the challenge we face before us. And I wanted you to talk a bit more about that, if you would.
Right. Well, one thing to be cautious about, I mean, the same thing happened to me when my book came out. I thought, well, the next thing I must write up is what methods can we use for geoengineering and air capture or carbon drawdown, getting rid of some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I get all the literature about it, and there's crazy ideas galore, and there's some things that look feasible but need to be developed, and you need to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, see what very typically people propose things that can't be scaled up, and let's cover the whole Arctic with plastic sheets and so it's kind of crazy things that in principle are good ideas, in practice you can't do it. So you need to separate what can be done with what can't be done, like this direct air capture, or I was talking about that in my talk, that things like crushing olivine rocks will gradually absorb carbon dioxide, but it's far too slow, and you'd have to cover the entire planet in a thick layer of olivine rocks, having mined them first. But people who have those ideas are really fanatical about them, and so I get hundreds of emails from the guy who thinks of olivine rocks, and nobody can tell him that, have you considered the magnitudes involved? And then there's pumping water onto sea ice to make the sea ice thicker, and that's being proposed, but when you look at how many pumps you'd need, it's something like 10 million pumps. And these sort of things can't be done, but there are other things that can be done, and or maybe can be done. So I thought I'd try and write a book on where, starting from where the other one left off, what can be possibly done with direct air capture or geoengineering, and I'm involved in the geoengineering project anyway with cloud brightening. So the trouble is, though, so I went to Penguin full of enthusiasm for this, because they're enthusiastic, having sold a lot of books, so they are a sort of bankable commodity. But they said, "Oh, sorry, we're bringing out a book about this," and they gave me the plan, and it's a multi-author book about about mitigation of climate change with all the geoengineering methods, all the carbon drawdown methods, and there's all these governance problems as well. So it was really everything I was going to put in my book seems to be coming out in this other Penguin book, which is due out in the spring.
Project Drawdown, is this?
That's it.
Yes. Interesting. I hadn't known that they were going to focus on the geoengineering solutions. I thought they were focusing largely on those mitation options that are already within our reach, direct reach.
Yeah, so it seemed to sort of take the wind out of my sails.
Okay.
So you think your book's going to sort of not be on that topic?
It won't be really. Not for any ideological reason. I was very persuaded in your book that we can't rule anything out, and that renewables, etc., aren't going to cut it in their own right. I think avoided deforestation and the restoration of degraded forests could play a part in addition to the afforestation issue, and I was persuaded also by your account that actually it's difficult to imagine huge swathes of afforestation because of the the conflict that would entail with other forms of use of the land. But no, this is about biodiversity and about fresh water and about soil and forests and climate. But the backdrop is the loss of the Arctic, and you've seen more of this than anyone.
Yes, I mean it's. I suppose when I started in Arctic research, it was 1970, and then the problem then was there were very few people working in the Arctic, and there was so little known that everybody had lots of problems to solve. It wasn't like most fields of science where there's thousands of people breathing down your neck, like the Hadron Collider, has 2,000 people writing the paper on it, and that kind of crazy thing where there's a few problems and a huge number of people. But in Arctic research, there were huge numbers of problems and very few people, so you could really get on and do things. And for a long time, people were really trying to establish how the Arctic works, how the ice works, what it does, what's the distribution of thickness, and what's the distribution of types, what's the state of the Arctic given the assumption that it's not changing. And that took a few decades, and then I started to find that it was changing by going out with the submarines and seeing the thinning, and suddenly, gradually, the scientists started to realise the Arctic was changing, and that took a few years to measure and understand that. But then the next stage, which has happened pretty recently, is the realisation that not only is the Arctic changing, but the changes in the Arctic are driving the changes in the rest of the world. It's not that the Arctic's just responding to climate change and, oh, isn't it interesting that we're losing sea ice is one of the effects of climate change, just like change in the species, which tree species flourishes in Manitoba or something. It's not a curiosity. It's that the change in the Arctic has all these feedbacks, which is driving change everywhere else, including low latitudes. Like sea level rise is Arctic driven, completely Arctic driven by Greenland melt, and yet that sea level rise is what's going to be wiping out cities and causing who knows what kind of catastrophes to civilization, because we'll all have to withdraw from the coastline. So the Arctic has gone from being an unknown part of the world that you study to see how it works to being a part of the world that's responding to climate change, and now it's a part of the world that's driving climate change, and that makes it really important, I think. So everybody's now an Arctic expert. Whereas when I was young, the entire population of Arctic researchers in 1971 went to the first international sea ice conference that was held in Reykjavik, and there were 90 people, and that was the entire global population of sea ice. So I was a graduate student then, and I immediately got to know all the other sea ice researchers in the world just by going to that conference. But now the sea ice conferences every week pretty much, if you bother to go to them.
And you're critical in the book of parts of the scientific establishment, or the IPCC, that has sort of underplayed or been quite conservative about the scale of Arctic loss vis-a-vis what you've understood and seen.
Yes. I think the ones that there's two big problems. I think one is there's too many modellers who never go to the Arctic, and it's because the field has grown and the number of people in it has grown enormously, but the amount of money available hasn't grown, and it costs quite a lot of money to do field work in the Arctic. You have to have ships and aircraft and camps and equipment and support people out on the ice. And an Arctic research program that involves field operations is pretty expensive. And that was okay when there were only a few people doing it. But now there's a lot of scientists. You still only have a few Arctic field programs, but you have this vast mass of climate modelers who try to apply climate models to Arctic change and Antarctic change, of course, but don't really ever go. They've never seen any ice, and so they're, rather than say, well, this means I don't really know what's going on, and perhaps I should go on a field trip and see what the ice looks like. They'll say, I know what's going on because my equations say this, and therefore anybody who says differently, like people who actually go and measure things, must be wrong. So there's a credible arrogance that they tend to adopt, which is, and there's a few, well, especially British ones, who are really bad in that respect. So that annoys me a lot. So I stuck some of that in my book, and, but not all. There's a lot more.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And then the other problem I think is with IPCC, that I think it is a sort of a body which has become kind of corrupted. I mean, people say no, it's okay. It's just that it's conservative because it only reports on published work, and so therefore anything it reports on is already to some extent out of date, but that's a good thing because it's conservative. But in fact, I've seen places where research results are distorted deliberately, and again I mentioned one of those in my book, where the most dishonest sea ice change graph I've ever seen. I was so angry with it. I mean, first of all, I went to the IPCC and said, look, this is a dishonest graph, and these are the ways in which it's dishonest. And Thomas Stocker, who runs the IPCC science, said, well, yes, but it's okay because we've got a proper graph of sea ice change somewhere else in the report, as if it didn't matter that they were misleading people with that first one. So I made sure I included that in the book. And it's because IPCC used to be a campaigning body when it was run by John Houghton, he was obviously very, very honest. And then when the science was led by Bob Watson, he was tremendously honest because he came up with a change in the carbon cycle modelling, and which showed that actually warming was happening maybe a third faster than previously imagined. So he made sure that went into the next assessment, and then the US immediately campaigned to get rid of him because they didn't want somebody who might be alarmist or just telling the truth they didn't like, because it was Bush had taken over. And so the Bush White House, which puts a lot of money into IPCC, just said it was unacceptable to carry on with Watson, so they'd have to have somebody else. So they got this Indian guy, and he was deliberately chosen as being kind of pliable and not easily overawed, and not dynamic and as Watson was. So, but in the end, he got to be more radical, but it took quite a long time. And then he seems to be making money on the side as well.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if you supported the Greenpeace campaign, Save the Arctic. Do you like the thrust of that?
Well, I mostly yes, but and in fact I get on well with Greenpeace. In fact, they've lent me their ship 3 times, I think. Yes. So I've had some very, very fruitful research cruises in the Arctic without having to pay for ship time, so I really appreciate that. I think that they really put their money where their mouth is, and I think the only things I don't, well, I say I don't appreciate, but I'm probably changing myself. Is their opposition to nuclear
Ah,
power?
yes, you in the book. Yes.
Yes, I really in the book. Well, in fact, after the book came out, I've been reading up about nuclear even more, and I'm getting more anti it actually. Not, uh, I mean, I still stand by what I said in the book, which is that the nuclear that's bad is French nuclear or or giant water cooled reactors, because all the nuclear accidents that have happened have been due to problems with the coolants, and so you have very complicated cooling systems that can go wrong, and then the thing goes up. Whereas you've got nuclear systems like pebble bed reactors, which are just solid state, and there's they're really safe. I mean, they the whole design is to make them inert. So if anything goes wrong, they just sort of dump out and nothing happens. So and the pebble bed reactor can be of any size as well. You can even have a kind of regional or a sort of thermal heating plant for a small town or something. You don't need giant power stations which have to be by the sea. So I can see that and then there's another load of nuclear that would be good is thorium, because thorium cycle is less destructive than uranium, and you can it doesn't produce anything that can be used for military purposes. So I can see lots of ways forward. The trouble is that the world isn't taking them. I mean, when the world goes for nuclear, like Britain, it goes for the worst possible kind, and that's probably because the British politicians are so stupid. And the the son of the person in the next office to me at Cambridge, it's Herbert Huppert, who's a very well-known fluid dynamicist, and his son Julian Huppert was MP for Cambridge, and he himself worked at the Cavendish. He was a physicist, and when he got to Parliament, he discovered he was the only MP with a scientific qualification out of 600 and something MPs, and those MPs have to make decisions on scientific and technical questions. So the Parliament had to decide whether we should build two gigantically expensive French design nuclear reactors, which where the power would cost an infinitely huge amount. And so anybody with scientific training would know that's an absolutely stupid thing to do. And if you want to go for nuclear, there's all these much better options. But there wasn't anybody with scientific training, so all the MPs just said kind of blandly, oh well, the French get all their energy from nuclear, so it must be okay, works for them, so we'll buy theirs. That kind of mentality of not knowing or caring anything about technical issues is typical of the British, and that's why we do things wrong all the time when it comes to science and technology and applying science to human needs like climate change.
What's the best case scenario? I mean, the book is very powerful. It's called A Farewell to Ice, and clearly, if we don't get climate change under control, that is the outcome of it. But what's the best case scenario?
Well, I guess the best case is discovering a way of taking carbon out of the atmosphere.
Over and above the transition to renewable energy, etc. It
Yes,
has to go beyond that. Yeah.
Yes, I don't think the transition to renewable will happen fast enough or be adequate. I mean, by the time we get around to doing it, there's so many small things you have to do, and put them all together, that you can see small things being done and everybody hailing the results, but the end point is a gradual decrease in carbon emissions, and that's not going to be enough. We've got to really radically reduce them now and get them down to zero soon, and get them to less than zero at a certain point not far ahead. So we can't depend on people driving smaller cars, and because first of all they all seem to want to drive larger cars, and we can't, without some kind of regimenting, you won't get people to act in their own best long-term interests. And if you want to avoid regimenting people, then something like capturing CO2 and out of the atmosphere will mean that not only will it solve the climate change problem, but it will solve it without forcing everybody to live some type of life that they don't want to live and might not be able to live. Well, it's not that you allow everybody to keep driving their SUV. You want to educate people to lead more renewable type lives, but the education can take a bit longer if you found some other way of getting rid of the CO2.
Hence the discussion of those kinds of technologies.
Yes, it's the techno fix, which of course people don't like techno fixes because they know on the whole they go wrong, but in this case I think you have to do one.
And there's also the environmentalist worry that a focus on that would then detract from the action and the investment required on renewables, etc. But I hear what you say about the scale and the pace of the change that's required.
Yes, it's the pace that's the problem. I mean, if we'd have started 30 years ago with the first report of IPCC, and that had actually produced action, and it almost did, because Margaret Thatcher was very, very keen, and that's why I said in my book, it's sort of a hymn to Margaret Thatcher, that whatever else that was wrong with her, she was right on climate change, and she was so, of course, energetic. She could have done a lot more given a bit of time, but unfortunately she wasn't given that time. So with her still running Britain, I'm sure we would have, and bashing people with a handbag, we would have got a lot further forward with dealing with climate change or mitigating it or finding ways to reduce it, getting international agreement. And we really lost a lot when she went, because her successors have been pretty dismal.
And she did understand the climate science.
Yes, she did. Yeah,
as you say.
She's probably the only one who did, because she came and spent a day in my lab, and she really knew what she was talking about.
Fascinating.
And I thought, this is impressive stuff.
I have one last question for you, conscious of your precious time, which is that I don't foresee in my life, regrettably, seeing the Arctic and or indeed the Antarctic. But for someone who knows it so well, and you describe it very beautifully in the book, what's it like? It's clearly a wondrous thing. But could you?
Yes, it is. Well, I mean, there are ways you could go there. I mean, apart from
the carbon emissions,
apart from a luxury cruise ship.
Oh yes.
For instance, the Russians are doing a Arctic Floating University, which is a research ship with about 80. It's a big one with about 50 berths, and going around. Well, it's going in July, so it's not going to be proper winter Arctic conditions, but you can see the Arctic seas and do. You have to have a research project, but if you've got one and they accept the project, you can go virtually free and get around Franz Josef Land and places like that. So that's an exciting thing. I've just learnt about that, so I'm going to try and go and take a couple of students next year.
Good.
So it is normally you need to go on some research operation, or or pay some massive amount of money and go on a cruise ship if you really want to see the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Must be a wonderful
but,
sight. And Putin, does he have a certain sensibility for the Arctic? A conservationist spirit?
only to ride around bare-chested killing things. I think that's his chief interest. No, he's well. That's the problem. And again, I was talking about this in my lecture here because people were asking about this methane pulse. I mean, the methane pulse, if it happens, will be a catastrophe, and it's quite likely to happen. But all the research on the emission of methane from the seabed has to be done in Russian territorial waters because that's where the methane is, and only this one Russian group can work there because anybody else from the West can't really easily get to do any work there. So you're dependent on possibly a gigantic threat can't be studied properly because it's inside in Russian waters, and Putin is just not keen on seeing research done that might lead to pressure to reduce use of fossil fuels because Russia depends completely on selling oil and gas, and so he wants to sell more oil and gas and drill more in the Arctic, get more oil and gas out, sell it. He's not going to be very keen on Paris Agreement and
all of that. So there's a job to be done there too. Well, Peter, thank you. It's been very good to talk to you. I will commend your book to all who like Peter, and it's a brilliant book. It's very powerfully written, and it's one feels it's the distillation of a lifetime of experience and knowledge.
Yes, it is really, because I call it Farewell to Ice partly because the ice is disappearing, but partly also it's because I'm disappearing.
Well.
I mean, at a certain point we'll have to retire, and as I leave the field, which, well, I don't intend to leave the field except feet first, but as I sort of draw down my effort, I suppose, I see the Arctic kind of ice vanishing through my career. It's just faded away, and so which is very, very sad to see that happening. So that's why I called it, gave it the title with the two meanings, a sort of personal meaning and a global meaning, and plus pinching it from Hemingway.
And a nod to Hemingway. Well, thank you very, very much, Peter, and all the best to you, and I hope we keep in touch.
Yes, well.